Hello and welcome to the Redefining Success podcast. I am your host Ruta, and this episode is the first part of the conversation I had with Cameron Shayne, martial artist and founder of Budokan University. I've been following Cameron and his wife Melaine for a while now, as I'm fascinated by the movement culture, which is beautifully connecting mind, body, and soul into one coherent experience. We start this conversation diving straight to the depth of the human existence and labels we tend to identify with. So here's what Cameron replied when asked how he would describe himself. I hope you enjoy this episode.
Well, that's a great question, and certainly has been a bit troublesome for me when it came to putting my biography into a container. It's been a little bit complex, given that I've had, as you said, a lot of different experiences in the human in the human form. So it's definitely it's probably best to narrow that down to professionally. I've been a martial artist, movement and mind coach for most of my adult life in some capacity. So if there's a single thread that runs through the fabric of my adulthood and I suppose my childhood as well, it's been that I have been predominantly a person who's been studying and teaching movement, philosophy, science, art, and mind or mental or cognitive science, art and philosophy. And why those two are paired together in this conversation is because I identified very early on that the way we move is a reflection of the way that we think. So I've never separated those two ideas in my work. And the complexity of that for a lot of people is that they do, in fact, see them as separate things. I have my workout, I have my fitness, I have my physical practice, and then I have my mental or cognitive, work that I do. Maybe I read some self-help books. I study some personal development coaching, type of work, and so I think most people keep them in separate containers, and I think that's an error. It's an understandable error because people reduce the experience of thinking to being a mental cognitive exercise, and they reduce movement to being a purely physical, anatomical, my arms are moving, my legs are moving. But I think what people are confused about is that thinking is in fact a physical act, as labor intensive as lifting weights. It's a mental muscle being being used. So that's why we're hungry after a lot of study or thinking or just conversation as we are running for several miles. So the first thing that a person has to do is to understand that these two functions are intertwined and that they act upon and influence one another, that they are not separate, that you cannot move without thinking and you cannot think without moving.
I wonder, how did your journey actually start? Because, like you say, a lot of people make this distinction between movement and thinking, and there's a lot of separation. So, what was your personal journey? Where did you start? Did you have that separation to begin with, or did you just have that realization that it's all unified since the very beginning?
Well, martial arts, at least traditional martial arts, take the example of kung fu, something really quite old. The two ideas have always been considered one thing. So when you see traditional kung fu, you see tai chi, you see nutrition, you see meditation. Same with the samurai kind of traditional Japanese karate styles. You'll see meditation connected to the practice as well. So I think that from very early on, it was introduced to me that these two things were, two sides of a coin. They were never independent of one another. So my mental clarity was essential to my physical clarity, because if I was trying to move, but my mind was unclear or was, distracted, I would move in a distracted manner. So you can see by just that simple example, you can't separate those two things. If I'm angry, I move angry. If I'm at peace, I move with peace. If my concentration is precise and accurate, if I'm able to focus on the point, then I can move to the point with efficiency and without getting snagged along the way. There's a beautiful part of the book of Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse that talks about, there's a moment where he's asking the teacher. There's a conversation between two people, and one is sort of the teacher and the student. And the students are like, "How do you manifest so skillfully?" And the answer is, "Well, my mind, what I want to create, like a rock being thrown into the water, it hits the surface without any resistance. It just finds its way immediately to the bottom. It's just straight, and like an arrow hits a target and just moves through it." That's how I manifest, he said. That's how I create. There's nothing between what I want, the action of wanting, and the manifestation of having it. It's so clear. I don't have all of this entanglement, seaweed and plants and whatever that might be floating around in the water, that's between this desire and creation of that is desired. So I think it's very powerful to understand that what we intend to create cannot be created efficiently with a lot of thought that is sort of becomes an obstacle to the path. So I can't constantly second guessing myself and wandering over here and being distracted by that. It's just that incredible focus and concentration on what I want. And I think that when we see successful people, at least what most people define as success, people that are able to create for themselves whatever they intend to create, whether it's wealth or it's fame or it's somehow production of something that to a lot of people may seem like some type of mammoth feat, something that, oh, I could never do that. Oh, that's, I don't know how someone's ever achieved that. And that's because most people never see the process of achievement. They just simply see a person and then an end result. And they say, oh yeah, I don't know how Jeff Bezos created Amazon. It's like, well, if you were to have been with Jeff Bezos since the beginning, you would have witnessed this very slow and oftentimes, I'm sure, difficult and moments that it had to step back 2 steps, this constant forward progress, there's regression. So I think when we actually see process, it's far less impressive or alluring, or there is some fantasy to what we think manifestation looks like. I mean, you never take your focus in a way off of the object, but there are these moments where, your eyes glance left or glance right because there are, it's like you're driving down the road and you see cars coming from the left or the right. You look over, you notice them, but your eyes are straight on the road toward your end goal. I think that's something that martial artists develop, is this ability to concentrate on what's in front of them, because if you don't, you get punched in the face. If I'm fighting something that's right here, I have to be here. Things come from here and here, from the sides. Punches, strikes don't simply come at you down a straight line, which would be very convenient because then you could predict everything that was happening, but rather strikes come from different angles, and your ability to see peripherally what's coming is very important, while at the same time never losing focus on what's directly in front of you. That's a martial artist training. So but it's the same training you would apply to any manifestation. To your question, you're taught that very early on in that practice, and you learn to be very good at it, because the implications of losing focus as a martial artist are not the same as losing focus as a barista. If I'm just making coffee, the worst thing that can happen usually is I'll just burn the coffee. Maybe, I splash myself with some hot liquid, maybe worst case scenario. But as a martial artist, I can break my face, literally, have serious injury from a lapse of concentration in martial arts. So it trains you to be aware and precise in a way that very few things do, because the mistakes that you make cost so much.
So many things you just mentioned. And first of all, it reminded me of a couple of clients that I work with who are golfers. And they told me exactly the same what you were describing, that in golf, it's 90% mental work and 10% physical skill. And concentration is everything. And how can you be extremely precise with your mind, completely shutting off everything that's around you, all the pressure, all the audience, the referees, like everything that's actually going on, including what's going on internally, to concentrate so well so that you can perform that physical action in a perfect way. It seems like that's exactly what you're talking about. How can one have such a precision in the mind with no distraction whatsoever, so that they can perform life in the best way possible? And yet it causes a question for me, what your opinion is about perfectionism or striving for excellence when it comes to controlling the mind and controlling the body? Where does it become too much?
My teacher once said to me, well, it's not true. He said it to me many times. His father once said to him, and then he now says to me, you must perform perfect or better. And the way that's interpreted by some people is perfect or better than the last time they did it. I interpret it as perfect or better than perfect. Which is in some way impossible, but to me it's do it perfectly or do it better than perfectly, which would be in some way to say, even to be innovative about it, to reinvent it so that you do it better than it's ever been done. And because obviously perfect is all subjective based on what we think is the perfect solution, but as we all know, perfection is also a process. Perfection can't be limited to a product, because that would completely contradict science. Science is not about understanding that something is completed, but it's understanding that this is as far as we've gotten, and this is currently the perfect model. And that if we keep questioning and we keep investigating and we keep practicing, that may also change, and there may be a new measure of perfection that we may expand that container. So for me, I take the concept of perfect or better quite literally, and I see it as an opportunity to continue striving for what can be improved. So I stay curious when it comes to execution of something, that little reserved curiosity rather than just the doing of something, because this is the perfect way to do it. That little bit of curiosity that I retain keeps me innovative as well. So though I'm executing something, I'm also questioning the merit of its perfection. Is there a better way to do this? Is this the only way to do this to produce the current standard of perfection? And if I don't question that, then I'm no longer a scientist. I'm no longer an engineer. I'm no longer an innovator. I'm just a worker, and I'm just simply performing a task. And I can teach anyone to perform a task once the task has been understood and learned and replicated and scaled. And now I can teach anyone to build a car. I can teach any person to follow a certain instruction. But the person who, of course, invented, the person who engineered and innovated that particular mechanism, that's the person I'm most interested in talking to and understanding how they think. I'm definitely less interested in the person who's just performing a function. And so people that I like in my life to surround myself with are innovators. They are, in some way, engineers. And so I don't believe personally in the idea of doing something as just a function of or utility, but rather I need to be in the process of innovative, creative, curious doing, building. So that's my take on perfection. I don't think you can actually ever do anything permanently perfect. There is, again, a temporary perfection, because you reach that place, of discovery. You've reached the sort of pinnacle of what we know, and then you attempt to push that boundary, that container, into what we didn't know we didn't know. So that's my approach to doing anything, is to say, why am I doing it this way? And I don't mind executing the task in this manner, because it's the current norm, it's the current standard. But all the while, I remain curious and I remain questioning the why, in case there's something I didn't know that I didn't know. And there's always going to be that. Science is reaching that point where, and I forget who made this very important distinction. They were talking about the limitations of science in the sense that we now know what things do very clearly. We're very, very far along. We're progressed quite well in understanding what things are doing, how the mechanism is behaving. Gravity, or how a radio wave or some type of invisible wave is transmitted, and how it can be received, how we can interact with that, which is what gives us the ability to be on this video call. But our limitation is in understanding why it does that. There's still that mystery to the scientific process. We really don't have a lot of understanding of why things do what they do. That's something we're still deeply investigating. That's easier to arrive at because it only requires the ability to observe. I can observe what something's doing and then go, oh, well, here's the pattern. I've watched it many times, and this is what it's doing. And now, because I understand what it's doing, I can predict its behavior. And that allows me to then work with that behavior. But to understand why it's doing that is a far more complex issue. It takes us into places that, we know. We're getting very close, as an example, to understanding how the universe was physically created, but we still don't know why. And maybe why is just this very, maybe that's something that's very specific to the consciousness of human beings, and not as essential as we think it is. It's more philosophical than maybe necessary. But there's something about humans that we feel that the why matters so much. And so we don't know why why these particular compounds came together to create life as we know it, organic matter. But we do know that they did. And we know which compounds did do that. Again, to understand why they actually did it for the first time, what was the moment that caused this? These are the questions that still elude us as as intelligent beings. So, to your question, it's very important to understand really what you're after in this process of investigation, remembering that perfection is something that is elusive and it's a moving target, and that you should not, in my opinion, you should not accept this. I've heard some of the narratives of, perfectionism is killing us, and we should. I'm like, no, our understanding of perfectionism is the problem. It's not perfectionism itself. Perfection is incredible when understood in the correct context. If perfection is someone's absurd pursuit of more, then this is, of course, foolishness. More does not mean perfect. Being efficient, being precise, being accurate, understanding how to do something with the least amount of waste, with the least amount of collateral damage. That's beautiful. When we observe nature doing that, because nature is so incredibly nature, like anything, is a process of something being done until this is the concept of natural selection. You go, and the things that don't do things efficiently and skillfully and well, they die off. And all that's left is what's doing it the most perfectly. And nature's constantly reinventing that idea of what is perfection. So you have to understand what the pursuit of perfection is philosophically to even understand what it is pragmatically, and from the perspective of finance, numbers, or cultural, social. Like when you start applying the idea of perfectionism to these very human constructs, you have to have a very specific understanding of that. It's not so different than nature. You have to be able to understand the nuances there, because you can't, it's not necessarily a one for one, in the way that some type of animal, as we are, has evolved, and through natural selection we've arrived at the sort of the most efficient version of us. But when you try to apply that to something like the economy, there's going to be some subtle differences there, and yet some consistent through lines, some places where you say, this does apply over here. The economy, as we know, is a ever-changing, moving, breathing thing. So the economy works beautifully, as an example, when you have 100, let's say you have 100 humans, and you've built an economic system or structure with 100 people. Well, that's completely predictable and controllable to a certain degree. I can make my currency, if I base my currency off of, a precious metal like gold, and as long as there's only 100 people, there's enough gold. But as soon as that number changes, now there's 200 and 300 and 400, and now there's a million, and now there's a billion, and now there's 8 billion. The economy doesn't work quite the same. So all of economists and these brilliant mathematicians, they struggle to make all this make perfect sense the way it made when it was in this very small container. Now this container is expanded, and with the expansion of the container has come an incredible amount of variables that were not present until the quantity of participants in the economy changed. So as the participants change, the variables change, and suddenly your formula doesn't work the same way. So you've got this constant adjustment that you have to make in order to make this economic formula work that really worked quite fine with this many people participating. Now you've got this many people participating, and you've made all of these adjustments, which you could think of them as amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution works great, and then you start making amendments. Why do we make amendments? Because society changes. Interpretations and definitions change. And so as society changes, we start amending the original document. So we start amending the original formula when this container expands. So there's no such thing as perfection. There's only what works perfectly at the time with these particular materials. And as those materials change, the participants change, so does the measure of perfection. And this is a complex conversation for a lot of people to have. And so they just go, okay, you just make up the law, or they just let politicians, government officials, corporate leaders, they let them make all the decisions and run society. And they expect all the rest of the folks out there to just get on board. And it brings us to conversations like vaccination things. It's like, okay, perfect example with since this is a current topic. Let's say that you have you're in Portugal, and in Portugal you have one of the highest rates of vaccination, I believe, in the world. Second to that is some of the other European countries, and there's a few other guys out there. But right now, when you think about, as an example, if I'm a 70-year-old adult and I am not in incredible health, I have your what would be considered standard health issues of a 70-year-old Homo sapien right now, high blood pressure, early onset of some type of cardiovascular issue, possibly some pre-diabetic issues. Being vaccinated makes a lot of sense, because the chance of me dying from COVID is quite high compared to the chance of me dying from or having an adverse reaction to a vaccine. So it's clear that being vaccinated for me gives me a better chance than what I may experience by being unvaccinated. So what happens here when you apply the same formula or thinking to children? Well, children have practically no mortality rate with COVID, but they do have some adverse reactions to being vaccinated. Some of the pericarditis, some of these heart inflammatory issues. So what happens is this kid's chance of being sick from COVID is very low, and this kid's chance of having a negative reaction from the vaccine is very low, but they're almost equal. So now, why would you vaccinate this kid? This is not the adult who has a much worse. The formula looks quite different when you apply it to two different groups. But as humans, we're applying it across the board.
One size fits all.
Correct. And this is how society or civilization is currently behaving, because there are too many people to apply these formulas. We're just trying to fix a problem, which is, it's not fixable because there's too many human beings. And most of these formulas only work when you apply them to very small amounts of population.
I love the variety in which and the depth in which you go into topics. And it seems like what you're talking about is this, I call it obsessive curiosity, where you don't take things for granted and you just have this obsessive curiosity to understand the why, the purpose behind, the reasoning behind, and what's actually happening underneath the surface, and really diving into the depth of what you are observing and becoming the observer also,
Mm-hmm.
like stepping away from the action itself as a participant, as an actor of the play, but also kind of distancing yourself from it and being like, okay, so what's actually happening here, and why is it happening the way it's happening, and why are people getting vaccinated, and why are kids getting vaccinated, and stuff like that, right? So, and something very important that you mentioned also, having that innovative outlook with every single action that we take. It's kind of redefining repetition, where you don't just repeat for the sake of repeating, but you're actually practicing in order to become better and better and better, and to master that act, or that or the way you think, or the way you do things, your behavior, all of these things, just simply because you want to become better at what you do and who you are being, who you are embodying, right? So at the end of the day, it can also become quite a dangerous place to be, where
you constantly chase something, you constantly want something else. And yet what you mentioned, that it's about the present moment. And I think this is something to really bring across for the people who are listening, that it's not just this continuous chasing of what's outside of you, but it's just tapping into the excellent in the present moment. How can I become the best version of myself right now? Not a moment from now, not a day from now, not compared to who I was yesterday, but now. Who can I be now at my best with the resources that I have, with the capability that I have, with the energy level that I have, and so on.
I hope you enjoyed the first part of the conversation with Cameron. So many people completely misunderstand perfectionism, holding themselves back from living life, fully embracing it, and aiming for excellence instead of perfection. So, in the second part of this conversation, which is the next episode of Redefining Success podcast, we talk about a balanced life of satisfaction and contentment. We also discuss what's reality and if what we experience as life isn't all just an illusion. Very, very, very interesting. Go ahead and listen to the next episode. And if you find this episode and the entire podcast helpful, please share it with people who will benefit from it. And by doing so, you will contribute to making the world a happier place. Thanks, and speak to you in the next episode.